In 1985, the man who built Apple Computer was escorted out of his own company. Steve Jobs was 30 years old, humiliated, and convinced his career was over. 11 years later, he came back and built the most valuable company in human history. To understand why Jobs had to be fired, you need to understand what Apple had become and what it was becoming. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak built the first Apple computer in a garage in Los Altos, California. Not because they had a business plan, not because venture capitalists told them to, because Wozniak wanted a computer for himself and Jobs saw the business opportunity. Apple went public in 1980, creating more millionaires overnight than any IPO in Silicon Valley history. Jobs was 25 years old and worth over $200 million. He was on the cover of magazines. He was interviewed like a prophet. But success did something strange to Apple. The company grew. It hired professional managers. It brought in a CEO from Pepsi, John Sculley, because Jobs himself demanded it. He believed Apple needed adult supervision to scale. And then something predictable happened. The professionals clashed with the visionary. The company's culture shifted from making insanely great products to making quarterly earnings projections. Jobs, who had always run on instinct and intensity, found himself increasingly marginalized within the organization he had built. By 1985, the Macintosh launch had underperformed expectations. The relationship between Jobs and Sculley had turned toxic. In a boardroom battle that May, the Apple board sided with Sculley. Jobs was stripped of his operational responsibilities. His title remained, but his power was gone. He lasted 3 more months before resigning. Here's what most people don't understand about what happened next. Most people would have retreated. Most people would have found a comfortable board seat, cashed their stock options, and spent the next decade telling war stories over expensive dinners. Steve Jobs did the opposite. He sold all of his Apple shares, every last one except a single share, so he would still receive the annual reports, and started over. He founded Next Computer in 1985. The idea was to build powerful workstations for scientists and universities. The execution was vintage Jobs, obsessive, expensive, and behind schedule. The Next Cube was a beautiful $6,500 black magnesium computer that almost nobody bought. By 1993, Next had stopped making hardware and pivoted entirely to software. But while Next was struggling, Jobs made another bet. In 1986, Jobs paid $10 million for a tiny division of George Lucas's film company. The division had 44 employees and no clear business model. Jobs renamed it Pixar. Over the next decade, he poured $50 million of his own money into Pixar, more money than he had made in his entire time at Apple. He nearly sold it multiple times. Disney tried to buy it for almost nothing. Jobs refused. In 1995, Toy Story changed everything. The world's first fully computer-animated feature film was a cultural phenomenon. Pixar's IPO that year made Jobs a billionaire for the first time, far richer than he had ever been at Apple. But Next was quietly dying. The company had burned through cash for a decade without ever finding product-market fit. Jobs had built one spectacular success and one spectacular failure simultaneously. Most people would have called it a wash. Meanwhile, Apple Computer was in serious trouble. The company that had once stood for creative rebellion was now a commodity PC maker bleeding market share to Windows machines. Their operating system was dated, their hardware was generic, their culture had grown bureaucratic and slow. Apple was losing $1 billion a year. Industry analysts were openly speculating about bankruptcy. In December 1996, Apple announced it was acquiring Next Computer for $427 million. It wasn't really a technology acquisition, it was a talent acquisition. And everyone in Silicon Valley knew it. Steve Jobs was coming home. He returned first as an advisor, then as interim CEO, a role he initially dismissed with the name I-CEO, the letter I standing for interim. But there was nothing interim about what happened next. In his first weeks back, Jobs did something radical. He looked at Apple's product line, 40 different desktop and laptop models, and cut it down to four. 4 products, that was it. 2 for consumers, 2 for professionals. Then he walked into the boardroom and fired every member of Apple's board except one. He rebuilt it with his own people who would let him move fast. In 1997, Apple was days away from insolvency. Jobs, who had returned as interim CEO with no salary except $1 per year, needed a miracle. He found it in an unexpected place, an enemy. Bill Gates appeared on a massive screen at Macworld, announcing that Microsoft was investing $150 million in Apple. The crowd booed. Jobs stood there absorbing the noise and made a case for partnership over rivalry. It wasn't a capitulation. With Apple stabilized, the real work began. In 1998, Jobs unveiled the iMac, a translucent, candy-colored desktop computer unlike anything the industry had ever seen. It sold 800,000 units in its first 5 months. Apple had product market fit again, but Jobs wasn't interested in computers. He was interested in the next big thing. In 2001, he launched the iPod, a music player so simple and so beautiful that it changed the entire music industry. iTunes followed. The music industry, resistant at first, eventually had no choice but to participate. Then came the iPhone in 2007. Jobs walked onto a stage and told the audience he was introducing 3 products: a phone, an internet communicator, and a music player. Then he revealed it was all one device. The crowd exploded. The iPhone didn't just become Apple's most successful product. It became the most profitable product in the history of commerce. Apple surpassed Microsoft as the world's most valuable technology company in 2010. It surpassed every other company on Earth not long after. Steve Jobs, a man who had been fired from his own company 22 years earlier, had built the most valuable organization in the history of capitalism. Steve Jobs died in October 2011, just one day after Apple unveiled the iPhone 4S. He was 56 years old. He had transformed 6 industries: personal computing, animated films, music distribution, retail stores, smartphones, and tablet computing. And he had done all of it after being fired. Here is the question nobody asks about this story. What would have happened if the firing had never occurred? Almost certainly, that version of Jobs never becomes what Jobs became. Because the decade he spent in the wilderness, building Next, building Pixar, watching one company fail and another succeed, changed him in ways that staying at Apple never could have. At Next, he learned about enterprise software, about operating systems, about building for developers. The Next operating system became the foundation of everything Apple built after 1997. At Pixar, he learned about storytelling, collaboration, and building a culture where creative people thrive. Every Apple product launch after his return bore the fingerprints of a man who had spent a decade at a film studio. The lesson at the center of this story is not the triumph at the end. It is the education that made the triumph possible. If you are in the middle of your own difficult chapter right now, if you have been fired, passed over, shut down, or told no, remember this: Steve Jobs called being fired the best thing that ever happened to him. If this kind of deep dive adds value to your journey, subscribe to Founder Fuel.